The Evening Express on the 25th of June, 1908, published the following piece. A small note on page 3. The Spanish liner Larache, from Buenos Ayres, has been wrecked between Muros and Puerto del Son. There are no details of the disaster to hand, but 40 passengers who were on board the vessel have reached Muros.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Larache, too close to the rocks.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Larache had started life in 1872, named the Jose Barro. The 1,250-ton iron screw steamer was built in the Sunderland shipyard of Oswald and Company and was sold to the company of Soler y Silla, based out of Barcelona. In 1874, only a couple of years after she was built, she was lengthened to 1,543 tons. In 1888, she was sold to the Compañía Transatlantica and renamed the Larache. Other than her being lengthened, it is hard to find any other record of any changes that were made to the ship, and by 1908, when she left Buenos Ayres, bound for Spain, the papers called her in poor condition and described her as an old tub of a ship. As an over 30-year-old steamship, she certainly could not be considered a new ship anymore, and nothing in the papers suggested she had been well maintained or cared for. When the Larache departed Buenos Ayres, she had an estimated 202 passengers on board. It was reported primarily people from Argentina, as well as 66 sailors, 4 officers, and 24 stewards to see to the needs of the passengers. On reaching the coast of Spain, the ship stopped at Vigo to drop off 105 passengers there on the 23rd of June, 1908. Having finished disembarking the Vigo passengers, the Larache left Vigo around 2 in the afternoon. The conditions that she found herself sailing in were later debated, with some saying it was a fog, and others denying it. Everyone could agree that the waves were choppy and rough. The captain of Larache, whose name varies enough depending on the source that we have foregone it, was very familiar with the coast. And in addition, they had brought on board a pilot at Vigo to assist them in traveling what was known to be a treacherous stretch of shoreline. Around 5 in the afternoon, the second officer, who had been on the bridge of the Larache, commented to the pilot that they were getting close to the Bulos rocks as he left the bridge. It does not seem to have been a comment made with much concern, though. It was, therefore, to the shock of everyone on board, when, only minutes after the second mate left the bridge, the ship came to a shuddering stop against a rock while going around 10 knots. As the ship came to a stop, she heeled over somewhat, pitching everyone violently to one side of the ship. The panic on board the ship was immediate. It was clear to everyone on board that the ship was sinking very fast, and it was later estimated that up to 40 of the passengers had not been able to reach the deck on time, and had been trapped below when the ship had gone down. There were attempts to launch the ship's boats, but they were soon almost all smashed, or those that did reach the water were not able to withstand the choppy waves. Matters might have been helped if there had been a voice in command to direct people, as needed, to safely launch the boats, but it was reported by the second mate later that the captain had appeared on deck and thrown himself overboard in a state of undress while shouting, "I am dying. Goodbye, my wife. Goodbye, my children." Another version of the story was that he had been standing on the bridge, and the shock of the impact had been what knocked him off of the bridge. One small boat from the ship was successfully launched from the ship by some of the sailors, and 10 members of the crew got into her. They tried to save their captain, but by the time they pulled him on board the boat, he was past saving. It was reported that he had been suffering badly from rheumatism, which had made him incapable of doing much to save himself. This boat proved to be the only boat to successfully launch from the Larache, and it too was soon swamped and sank with everyone on board of it. With no clear leadership, it was now up to the remaining members of the crew to do their best to help the passengers who, at this point, were grabbing the pieces that they could find of the shattered boats, as well as planks from the ship itself, to use as flotation devices. Many people began to strip articles of their clothing off so that they would be as little weighed down as possible when they ended up in the water. One of the ship's firemen took it upon himself to pass out lifebelts, but he was soon surrounded by desperate passengers, and he did not have enough lifebelts to go around. One man claimed 2 lifebelts and refused to give either up. When he was washed ashore later, he still had both in his possession, but they had not saved him. A group of women was handed the one remaining lifebelt that the fireman had, and a fight immediately ensued. The woman who first got it was stabbed by another in her desperation, but once again, having a lifebelt in her possession did not prove to be sufficient, and she was also washed ashore lifeless. By now, the ship had sunk enough that the waves were washing the deck, and even if people were reluctant to leave the ship, they were soon washed overboard while clinging to anything close to hand that seemed the most likely to keep them afloat. Families had been traveling together, and parents now clung to their children and did what they could to save them. One wealthy family, who had been traveling in first class, was still holding one another as they were washed overboard. The family consisted of a father, a mother, and their 4 daughters. Only the mother and one of the daughters would be saved. The second mate also reported having seen a woman with all 4 of her children clinging to her slip below the water. All across the sea was becoming a mass of struggling people crying for help and wreckage from the quickly sinking ship. Survivors reported that the ship only took 6 to 9 minutes from striking the rock to becoming entirely submerged. Soon, only her masts were sticking above the waves as a reminder of where she had been. The wreck had not gone unnoticed on shore. In Muros and the surrounding area, fishermen began to quickly direct their boats to the wreckage to save as many as they could. More boats tried to approach, but they were beaten back by the rough seas and weren't able to assist. In total, 47 people were brought into Muros, though 2 of them did not survive for long once they were on land. 15 more people were brought into Puerto by fishermen who had saved them. The fishermen, faced with shocked people who for the most part were not wearing any clothing, began to strip off their own coats and overalls and dress the survivors in them. As the boats began to unload the survivors, a more clear picture began to be formed of just how heavy the toll of the wreck had been. It was reported that out of the ship's crew, the only people who had survived were the second officer, who had been the one to mention to the pilot how close they were getting to the dangerous rocks, the second engineer, a sailor, and the ship's purser. The pilot, who had been at the helm when the ship wrecked, was also able to reach the shore, but he had to be immediately protected since the passengers who had survived, on seeing him, expressed a very strong desire to get their revenge on him. a later investigation would only partially excuse the pilot from blame. It was discovered that he had not struck the Buenos rocks, but that he had instead run into rocks that were not marked or incorrectly marked on the chart that the Larache had. The Zimiela shoals were marked at 3 fathoms, but this was incorrect, and the water was much more shallow in that spot than the pilot would have believed. Not only that, but the rock that the Larache had struck was not even marked on the charts. A buoy was immediately placed on it as a navigational hazard until the charts could be updated. This much was in the pilot's favor. Less in his favor was how familiar he was with the coast, and the fact that experts insisted that even if they had not struck the Zimiela shoals, the course he had chosen would have brought them directly into the Mejidos shoals, which he definitely should have known about. Not only were the Mejidos shoals charted, but they also had made the shipping news in the recent past because in 1905, the Spanish warship, the Cardinal Cisneros, had been wrecked on those rocks. For an experienced pilot to have chosen such a route raised a lot of eyebrows in Muros and the surrounding area. The survivors were reportedly met with every hospitality possible in Muros, until word could be sent out about what had happened, and further aid could arrive. People opened their homes and wallets to ensure that the victims had every comfort possible, but for many of the people who had survived, the loss was beyond material. It was reported in the papers that the mother and daughter of the family who had been washed overboard together had made a particularly heartrending sight at a church service they attended. As soon as word reached the Marquis de Comillas, who owned the Compañía Transatlántica, about what had happened, it was reported that he telegraphed the closest agents to Muros to tell them to spare no expense in assisting the survivors. Unfortunately, it was becoming clear that the people saved by the fishing boats right after the wreck were going to be the only people to be saved. Remains were now washing up on shore, and due to the most of the passengers having removed articles of clothing, they were proving challenging to identify, only adding to the confusion and pain of families who had loved ones traveling on the ship. The Corona Salvage Company was sent out almost immediately to help where they could. The divers that were sent down found that the bridge of the Larache was at 17 fathoms, and the hulk of the wreck was at 25 fathoms. She was considered past all recovery. While efforts were being made to bring what comfort was possible to the survivors, word of the accident had begun appearing in papers around the world, though often with less than accurate information. Some of the papers reported that there had been no casualties at all, while most severely underreported the number lost, or inflated the number saved. In many cases, it was reported that the captain had been saved when he had been pulled out of the water by the boat. This stream of confused information, doubtless, also did nothing to help the families of those who had been lost. As things became more clear, and people were able to interview the survivors, the final estimation of those lost was placed around 150. Though even this was misreported by many of the international papers as the number that had been saved. What everyone could agree on was that the most fortunate part of the wreck had been that over 100 people had been disembarked in Vigo right before the wreck. Otherwise, the cost of life would have, doubtlessly, been even higher. The people who had survived were eventually loaded into the steamer Coruna and brought to the city of A Coruna, for which she was named, where again they were met with the greatest kindness and sympathy. no one was insensible to the terrible event they had endured.
For more information, please see the London Standard from the 27th of June, 1908, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.